For millennia, one river has been the lifeblood of a civilization. The source of its power, its myths, and its very survival, the Nile. For Egypt, the river isn't just a feature on a map, it's the nation's entire existence. But today, hundreds of miles upstream, a new reality has been built from $4 billion of concrete and steel. It's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and it now stands astride the Blue Nile, the tributary that provides over 85% of the water flowing into Egypt. This one dam now effectively controls the lifeline for over 100 million Egyptians. For more than a decade, this megastructure has been at the center of a tense diplomatic standoff. But now, with years of negotiations officially at a dead end, two of Africa's most powerful nations are being pushed to the brink. The talk has shifted from cooperation to confrontation. Egypt has declared the security of its water a red line, while Ethiopia accuses its downstream neighbor of trying to sabotage its future. So how did we get here? How could this crisis over the planet's most vital resource explode into the 21st century's first major water war? We're going to break down the history of mistrust, what's at stake for both nations, and the chilling military calculations that could come next. Section 1. The Lifeline and the Mega Project. To really grasp the gravity of this crisis, you have to understand just how totally reliant Egypt is on the Nile. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously said, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile," and that statement is more true today than ever. Over 97% of Egypt's fresh water comes from this single river. It feeds the farms that feed its 114 million people, powers its industries, and provides drinking water for its sprawling cities. Egypt is already below the United Nations threshold for water poverty, and its population just keeps growing. Any significant cut to the Nile's flow isn't just an economic problem, it's an existential threat. And that's why the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, is seen as such a monumental challenge in Cairo. Construction kicked off in 2011, and it's now Africa's largest hydroelectric project. This thing is an engineering marvel, stretching 1.8 kilometers wide and standing 145 meters tall, just miles from the Sudanese border. Its reservoir can hold a staggering 74 billion cubic meters of water, and its turbines are designed to generate over 6,000 megawatts of electricity, more than doubling Ethiopia's current output. Here you have the core of the conflict, a clash of two vital, seemingly incompatible national interests. For Ethiopia, a nation of over 120 million, where most people lack reliable electricity, the GERD is a symbol of hope and sovereignty. It's their path out of poverty. For Egypt, that same dam is a potential chokehold on its national survival, giving an upstream nation the power to turn off the tap. While there have been other disputes over shared rivers, there are few, if any, historical precedents for a situation of this scale, where the water supply of one major nation is so completely dependent on a dam controlled by another. Section 2. A History of Mistrust. The roots of this fight aren't just in concrete and turbines, they're buried deep in colonial-era politics. For most of the 20th century, the rules governing the Nile were based on two agreements, a 1909 treaty and a 1959 deal between Egypt and Sudan. These treaties, signed during a time of British influence, gave almost all the Nile's water to Egypt and Sudan. They even gave Cairo veto power over any upstream projects. Now here's the crucial part. Ethiopia, the source of over 85% of that water, never signed on to these deals and has always rejected them as unfair colonial relics. From Addis Ababa's perspective, why should it be blocked from using the water that originates on its own land to help its own people? For decades, Egypt's military and political dominance was enough to enforce the old rules. Various Egyptian leaders openly threatened war to protect their historical rights, creating a climate of fear that stopped any major upstream projects from happening. This power imbalance created a deep well of resentment. Ethiopia saw Egypt's stance not as a defense of its needs, but as an attempt to maintain a hydro-hegemony that kept Ethiopia down. So, when Ethiopia started building the GERD in 2011, it wasn't just building a dam. It was making a bold statement that the old order was finished. It was a power move, made possible by Ethiopia's growing economic and political influence, and it signaled a direct challenge to the regional balance that had defined the Nile for over a century. Section 3. What's at stake? National imperatives. The stakes here are, frankly, existential for both countries, and that's why finding a compromise has been basically impossible. For Ethiopia, the GERD is the single most important project in its history. It's a source of incredible national pride, mostly paid for by its own citizens. With over 60% of its population living without electricity, the 6,000 megawatts the dam promises aren't a luxury. They're essential for building factories, improving schools and hospitals, and lifting millions out of poverty. Ethiopia also plans to export electricity to its neighbors, earning cash and establishing itself as an economic power in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopian leaders argue that the dam is for power generation, not water consumption, and that it will actually help downstream nations by making the flow more regular and preventing floods. For Egypt, the story is one of pure survival. The country already has a massive water deficit. With a fast-growing population squeezed into a thin strip of fertile land, any drop in water flow is catastrophic. One study projected that a significant reduction in flow could cost the Egyptian economy over $50 billion and wipe out millions of jobs, mostly in agriculture. That would threaten Egypt's food supply and could spark the kind of social and political unrest that has toppled governments before. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has repeatedly said that Egypt's water security is a red line, a message meant for both Ethiopia and his own people. Meanwhile, Sudan is stuck right in the middle. After first opposing the dam, Khartoum has warmed up to the potential upsides like cheap electricity and the regulation of devastating seasonal floods. But Sudan also shares Egypt's fears about the dam's safety and the lack of a legally binding agreement to manage it, especially during droughts. Unilateral moves by Ethiopia are seen as a direct threat. The ongoing civil war in Sudan has only made its position more fragile, leaving it with little ability to mediate or withstand the fallout of a bigger conflict. Section 4. The collapse of diplomacy. The road to this standoff is paved with more than a decade of failed negotiations. Since 2011, there have been countless rounds of talks involving all three countries, mediated by everyone from the African Union to the United States and the UN. And despite a Declaration of Principles signed in 2015, every attempt at a real, lasting deal has hit a brick wall. And the central disagreement hasn't really changed. Egypt and Sudan want a legally binding treaty that sets out the rules for filling and operating the dam. They need clear, enforceable rules for how much water Ethiopia must release, especially during long droughts, and a solid process for handling future disputes. For them, anything less is just too big a risk. Ethiopia, on the other hand, has fiercely resisted any deal it sees as an attack on its sovereignty. It argues that guidelines should be enough and that it can't be tied to rigid rules that might stop it from generating power when it needs to. From its perspective, Egypt's demands are just a sneaky way to hang on to its old monopoly over the Nile. This stalemate has led to both sides accusing each other of negotiating in bad faith. Egypt claims Ethiopia just used the endless talks to stall for time, while it kept building and filling the dam. Ethiopian officials have in fact proceeded with filling the reservoir on their own schedule, moves that Cairo calls provocative violations of international law. In turn, Ethiopia accuses Egypt of being aggressive and trying to use the UN Security Council to bully them. By mid-2025, the talks had officially collapsed, leaving the situation more volatile than ever. Section 5. The war drums. With diplomacy dead in the water, the rhetoric has gotten much more aggressive, pushing the what-if of a war into actual strategic planning. President el-Sisi's Red Line declaration wasn't just talk, it was a clear signal that the military option is on the table. These words have been backed by action, with Egypt deepening military cooperation with Ethiopia's neighbors like Sudan. In a move widely interpreted as a direct message to Addis Ababa, Egypt has also deepened security ties with Somalia. Analysts see this as a strategy of strategic encirclement, designed to show Ethiopia that Egypt can project its power across the region. However, a direct military strike on the dam itself would be incredibly risky. Egypt has a modern military with advanced jets and missiles, but Ethiopia is over 1,000 miles away, and an air campaign would be a logistical nightmare. The dam is also a hardened, well-defended target. A failed strike would be a massive humiliation. A successful one could be even worse. Breaching a dam this size would unleash a biblical-scale flood, causing unimaginable devastation in Sudan and Ethiopia and guaranteeing a full-scale bloody war. What's more likely, then, is an escalation of proxy warfare. The Horn of Africa is already a powder keg, and both nations are competing for influence. There are growing signs that Egypt and Ethiopia are backing opposing sides in their neighbors' conflicts, from Sudan to Somalia. This shadow war lets both sides apply pressure without firing a shot at each other directly, but it also carries the constant risk of miscalculation and spiraling out of control. And with other powers like Turkey and the Gulf states all having their own interests in the region, the Nile Basin is turning into a geopolitical minefield. Section 6. The Unseen Crisis. Beyond the headlines about military threats and failed talks, there's a slower, quieter crisis unfolding. The severe pollution of the Nile itself. This emergency threatens millions of lives and dramatically raises the stakes of any dispute over water quantity. For decades, the Nile has been used as a dumping ground for a toxic cocktail of untreated sewage, industrial wastewater filled with heavy metals, and agricultural runoff loaded with pesticides. This pollution has devastating consequences. It contaminates drinking water, poisons fish, and makes huge volumes of water unusable. The GERD's operation threatens to make this pollution crisis much worse. A reduced flow downstream means there's less water to dilute all those contaminants. The pollutants will become more concentrated, potentially turning stretches of the river into toxic sludge. This would hammer Egypt's agricultural sector, which employs millions of people. Trying to farm with increasingly salty and polluted water could slash crop yields, threaten food security, and trigger massive social unrest. This environmental dimension shows that the conflict isn't just about a future threat. It's about a catastrophe that's already happening. The fight over the volume of water in the GERD is inseparable from the crisis of its quality. For the millions of people who live along the Nile, the danger isn't just a potential war, but the daily reality of a river that is slowly being poisoned. Even if a single shot is never fired, the combination of less water and more pollution could trigger a humanitarian disaster. This is easily one of the most complex and dangerous geopolitical flashpoints on the planet. The needs of both countries are legitimate, and the consequences of getting this wrong are catastrophic. So what's the way out of this mess? Is war inevitable? Or can a diplomatic solution that respects everyone's rights still be found? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you're getting value out of this analysis, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is complete. It stands as a monument to a nation's ambition, and its reservoir is filling. With every day that passes, the water level behind its massive wall rises, and so does the tension between two of Africa's great powers. This crisis has moved beyond technical arguments over water flow. It's now a profound struggle over history, sovereignty, and national destiny. The competing stories are powerful and deeply felt. Ethiopia's dream of development is crashing head-on into Egypt's need for survival. Diplomacy has failed, and the language of war is now disturbingly common. The question is no longer if the balance of power on the Nile will shift, but whether that shift will be managed peacefully or paid for in blood. The first major water war of the 21st century isn't some distant fantasy. It's a ticking time bomb in the heart of Africa. And for the more than 250 million people who depend on this ancient river, the clock is running.